Good evening. It is so much better having people in here on a Sunday night so that I don't just have to talk to a camera and pretend it's a person. So we certainly appreciate all of those who are here tonight. We do appreciate all of those, and Larry and Doris are here tonight. That's great to see them out, and it's exciting to see more people come and be able to be with us. And I know there are many that cannot be here who are watching live stream, but I do want to encourage you, if you can be here, be here. There's nothing like it with worshiping and fellowshipping with our church family. I'll have one really quick announcement. I did not get a chance to tell Greg tonight, but there's been a lot of people asking me about camp, and I wish I had something to tell them definitively, but we are trying to right now we're trying to reach the board. A lot of the board has actually moved, and so I finally got a name. I'm going to try to call him. Wayne's kind of in the same boat. I know he's probably been asked a lot as well. And as soon as we know something as far as the campground is concerned, because it has everything to do with, if we're able to even go up there, if the camp's going to be open, if they're going to allow cabins and everything. And so as soon as we find something out, we will start spreading the word with it. But just start praying about it. I know it would be a great encouragement. And so that's kind of where it stands right now. So for Sunday night, as you know, we've started this series on looking at these questions that Jesus asked. This is some of the most thought-provoking information that I think we could ever pull out of the Bible. With, of course, all of it is because it comes from the mind of God. It's God-breathed, but when you start looking at the lessons that Jesus taught, what a way he had with people, and to get them to understand. And so many of these lessons that were learned as as people would ask him questions, or as people would start doing certain things, he would ask them a question in return, or he would ask questions just to really try to get it going with, trying to reach them. And so as we look at all these different questions that he asked, and there were a lot of them, hopefully it will help us the way that it did them, who was sitting there in his midst, listening to him. The one we have tonight, it actually comes from Matthew chapter 6, and verse 25, and the same question is actually asked also that Luke records in Luke chapter 12 and verse 25. Now, when you look at Matthew chapter 6, and a number of these questions were asked within, this is within the Sermon on the Mount that we have, and he would ask these questions to his disciples that were with him, such as the case is tonight. But if you look at Matthew 6 and verse 25, Jesus starts out right here. He says, "Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life." And then when you get to verse 27, he asks the question that really kind of tails this statement. And he asks them, which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature? Now when you look at the translation of this, I just read the New King James. That's usually what I use when I preach. But if you have a different version, such as the New American Standard or just ESV or anything else, likely you're going to see having this to do with time. In other words, which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit or 1 moment to his time or to his place here? And that's exactly what it means when you look at the translation of this. The cubit to his stature is not a physical reference, it is a time reference right here. And what he's saying to them, what he's asking them is, which of you by worrying can add 1 more moment to his life? And and it's such a profound thing to think about, because we spend sometimes so much worrying, and all it is it's counterproductive. It works against us, and it's not going to add anything to our life other than unnecessary and unneeded stress. And that's what he's asking his disciples right here. That word, when you look at it, that word worry is such a strong word, and it's such a negative word at that. Worry, the definition of it is anxiety. It is having an irrational fear about something. It is presuming something, and very often it leads to depression. We get so worked up, and we have this fear of that something is going to happen or that something could happen, And it just consumes us so much that we become depressed about it. And we just think there's no hope. We're not going to get beyond it. We're not going to be able to deal with it. And that's where the depression comes in. I create, these hypothetical scenarios in my mind, asking things like, well, what if this? And what if this? And I just, start coming up with all of these different ideas, all of these different scenarios, and none of it has even happened yet. And likely none of it is going to happen, but I just keep coming up with it because I become so stressed about a situation. I come up with a worst case scenario, and then I just decide that, it could happen. And a lot of the time, it actually does happen because I will it to happen, because I've just created this whole, this whole situation coming out of nowhere. And I think, it's got to be so bad, and it's going to happen that way. Now, it doesn't always happen like that, but that's what worrying does. And that's exactly what it means. And when he's talking to his disciples right here, and it's not just right here, there's a lot of different places in Scripture that it talks about worrying, and there's nothing good that comes from worrying. And so we're going to look at this tonight and see what Jesus meant, and we'll see what some of the apostles have to say as well about worrying. But like I said, worrying, when you look at it, is counterproductive. Number one is it distracts us. You think, when I start worrying about something, I become so involved with it sometimes that it becomes distracting to all the work that I have to do. We stress over what might happen. We stress over things that I can't even control. I can't tell you over this last year how many people worried about what the situation was going to be like, what it's going to be like here, what it's going to be like in the nation, and they get so worked up over things that I can't control. I can't control decisions that are going to be made in this country. None of us can. I can't control this virus. I can't control how bad it gets. I can't control what the situation might be in certain environments. And so when I start to worry about things like this, what it does is it distracts me from my work. It distracts me from my family. It distracts me from reading my Bible. It distracts me from all of these different things, because all I can do is think about that, these decisions over here, and I can't do anything about it. My name's not in the hat when it comes to making decisions like that. Worrying is also illogical, because what it causes us to do is to put stock in something that is less than God's capability of doing it. And think of how counterproductive that is. I pray, and I think, I tell God, oh God, I have all of the trust in you, and I just put all of this in your hands, and then I turn around, and what happens? I start stressing about it, and I talk to other people about it, and the more I talk to other people about it, it just starts to embellish itself, and I get, it just grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden, I'm getting in conversations with the very thing that goes against with what I'm even praying to God about in the first place. And it does me no good. And so it's illogical to think about and worry about things that I know are smaller than what God's capable of doing. When we pray to God, and we're going to get into this a little bit tonight, put it in God's hands and let Him take care of it if you want Him to really take care of it. It also occurs when we stop trusting in God, which kind of goes hand in hand with it. I worry, and I work myself up to the point where I just stop trusting that God can even take care of something. And so I just stop praying altogether. Or I stop reading my Bible, or I just stop communicating with people that I know can build me up or help edify me, encourage me. But that's what worrying does. And when you look at Matthew chapter 6, this goes against everything with what God intends for us. When you look at verse 31 of Matthew chapter 6, that same chapter, look at what he says right here. He says, "Therefore do not worry, saying, well, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear?" See, these are all physical things, isn't it? That's what people worry about in this world. All these physical things that I have no control over. I can try, but if I don't have them and I can't do anything about it, then what's the point? He says, why do you worry about all these things? And then he says something very interesting right here. He says, for after all these things, the Gentiles seek. You look at that word Gentiles, and in this context right here, the Gentiles represent those who have no covenant relationship with Christ to begin. He's saying, don't worry about that. He's saying, why you worry about all these physical things? That's what the Gentiles, that's what those outside of Christ, that's what they do. See, people in the world get all worked up over all these things because they don't have Christ. They have nowhere to try, to engage and connect spiritually. And what it does is it really causes a lot of unnecessary stress for those who are out in the world. They worry about the carnal things. But we have something more, don't we? I know that being a Christian, being someone who is in Christ, a child of God, I have someone to turn to who I know feels my pain, and I know he cares about me, and I know he's going to walk with me through whatever situation it is. He has been with every Christian since last March of 2020. When we were stressing and we were, looking at social media and just sandblasting 2020, and I can't wait till I get out of 2020, and all the memes that we see on Facebook, and we personify 2020 as this monster that we just want to do away with and put behind us, right? And God was there through that whole time. Did you let him be with you? Did you let him walk with you? Because when I worry, I stop him from doing anything, from being able to act and be with me in my life. And so what do I do when I'm worried? How do I handle it, and how do I respond? Because we do get worried. Even as Christians, we do get worried. And how amazing it is that we can turn to Scripture to find out how we deal with worrying. Because Jesus says, don't worry. Why would you worry? This is what the Gentiles do. But I can turn around and say, okay, well, how do I stop this, right? Look over at Philippians chapter 4, if you will. This was a letter written by an apostle. And not just written by an apostle, but it was an apostle who was in prison at this time in Rome and had no idea what the outcome of it was going to be. Paul writes this letter to them. And then when we look in chapter 4, Philippians, we see the recipe that Paul gives us for being free from worry right here. And it starts with verse 6. Look at this. Paul writes, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, look at this right here, by prayer and supplication. You see, the first thing we need to do to be free from worry is to go to God in prayer. Let him know specifically what is it that is so distressing in my life. And when we go to him, ask for help. Paul says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Paul was in a stressful situation being in prison. But he said, you know what? I'm going to pray to him because I know that God hears me when I do it. And so he says, there's the first thing, is to go to God in prayer, to be anxious for nothing. The second thing comes in verse 7 right here. He says, put it in God's hands. This can be challenging, but it's necessary. But Paul says, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, look at this, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. Put it in his hands. I love when Jim gets up here and he does the elder's prayer, or he talks about a lot of things with, when he's dealing with prayer requests or whatever, because he'll always say, he'll always say that peace that passeth all understanding. That's a biblical term right there. And it is a biblical practice that we ought to be practicing. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ. Put it in his hands. If you hold your place right there, you look over at Peter's writing, 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. Peter talks about something very similar right here. He writes to these early Christians who are being persecuted, and he says, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. You want to know what stress is, what worrying really is, or a comparison? Imagine carrying a heavy box. And the further you go with this box, the harder and harder it gets to carry until finally you get to a point where you just have no more energy with it. That's the equivalent to carrying a burden of stress. And Peter says, cast it on the Lord. Let him carry it. When I am so weighed down with the burden of stress and the burden of worry and the burden of concern and all these things just, in my life just pile up, cast it on God. We have a tendency to say we want to do that. We have the intention of doing that. But then we turn around and we keep stressing about it. Know that when you go to God, he's there and he is feeling everything that you're going through. And can I really put it in his hands and then let it go? God has his to-do box. Let him do it. Don't just keep putting your requests in there and then just taking them out. That's not going to work that way. You give something to God. Give it to him. And tell you that's the end of it. The third thing Paul says right here is found in verse 8. He says, it says to take an inventory of everything that God has done, everything that, and how he has helped you. He says in verse 8, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Think of that. When we're weighed down, when we're burdened with all this worry and this stress and wondering, this uncertainty, think of everything that God has done in your life. I do it all the time. It's amazing when you start to think that, I've got this wing and I've got this added up and I've got, it's just stacking stuff. But look at what he has done in other parts of your life to get you right here, right now, tonight, in this auditorium. Or if you're in your living room, where it has gotten you up to this point. Take an inventory. Look at everything that God has given to you. He says, if there is anything that is lovely, anything of good report, meditate on these things. Think about them. Dwell on that. Dwell on the good that God's done for us. Because we know that there is nothing that God is going to be involved with in your life if you're a Christian that is ever going to be bad. That doesn't mean bad things won't happen. But he knows you. And he knows what you go through. And finally, we see in verse 9, follow the Lord's example. Paul says, the things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do. And the God of peace will be with you. Think of what Paul went through in his life. We know he went through shipwrecks. We know he was beaten numerous times. There was one point in his life where it says he was beaten 39 lashes. Paul went from worrying to being so engaged in God that he was not afraid to face death. And by the end of his second letter to Timothy, he said, I am ready to receive my crown. I've fought a good fight. He wasn't afraid to die. He wasn't afraid because he knew that no matter what happened to him, that God was going to be with him. And he could walk every day and wake up every single day knowing that I don't have to worry anymore. Does it mean I won't be concerned about certain things? No. But I don't have to worry about certain things. And there's a difference between being concerned and being worried. Learn how to be content and place all trust in the hands of the Lord, because he knows what you're going through. And there's nothing in our lives that is too much for him. He wants us to come to him. There's nothing that he won't be able to take care of, and there's nothing that he doesn't want us to bring before him. You know, it's interesting, in India, if you're walking through rural roads, and I can't imagine, very many people here, if any, have been to India. I haven't been, but I know a lot of missionaries who have been, a lot of preachers who've been over there. But if you're walking through India on these rural roads, you occasionally come across a post with a sturdy shelf about shoulder height. And they call this shelf, it's labeled Soma Tonga, which means resting place. And what it's intended to do is when people are walking through or hiking or doing some extensive traveling, and they have this heavy load, they place their heavy load on the shelf for relief. And once rested, they continue their journey. It's called Somas Tonga, translated is the resting place. Christians in certain parts of India called Jesus my Soma Tonga, my resting place. I can't think of a more comforting idea about the Christ. He's my resting place. And when you look at Hebrews chapter 4, you really get a good understanding of why they call him this. In Hebrews 4, beginning in verse 9, the writer says, "There remains therefore a rest for the people of God." This is a spiritual rest right here. This is why they call him my resting place. "For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works, just as God did from his." Can you imagine having complete peace? Having that rest in him? See, it's not about eliminating obstacles. It's about knowing that when they do come, that God's going to be with us. That is the resting place. There's no need to worry, because we can know that we have rest with the Lord, and he sees us, and he knows us. Christ assures his people, "I have taken care of you this long, and I am not about to give up on you if you don't give up on me." Problems may not disappear, but he is mindful, and he walks the difficult road with you and me. Stop trying to carry the load yourself. I want to urge you, if you're here tonight, here in person, if you're watching at home, doesn't matter, stop trying to carry the load yourself. Let's put your worries in God's hands. And if you have need, come forward so that we can pray. Let your prayers be known by, you can contact us as well, because we want you to have that resting place the way that Jesus wants to be your resting place. Let's stand and sing.